Chapter 8, Lecture 2, Monopoly, Monopolistic Competition, and Oligopoly. In the previous lecture, you actually learned about whether a perfectly competitive market is relevant to medical care. You learn about using supply and demand to explain rising healthcare costs. In this lecture, you will learn about basically comparing and contrasting the perfect competition and pure monopoly with respect to resource allocation. And then we talk about the intermediate market outcomes, such as monopolistic competition and oligopoly. And then we talk about a conceptual and empirical framework for defining the relevant market, measuring the market concentration. So remember, in a perfectly competitive market, we said that the interception of supply and demand determines the equilibrium, basically price and equilibrium quantity, right? The interception of supply and demand. And we said that the area below the demand curve and above the price determines the basically consumers surplus, PCAC, and the area below the price level and above the supply determines basically the producer surplus, PCCG. So the net gain from the trade in the perfectly competitive market is ACG, right? So now let's see, in the monopoly, determines the level of production at the intersection of marginal revenue and supply. So the marginal revenue has the same intercept as the demand curve, but twice the slope as each level of output. So this is the marginal revenue, and the monopoly is setting its level of production at the intersection of supply and marginal revenue, right? The quantity for monopoly is QM, and then they go up and intersect with the demand curve, and at that point they set their price at PM. So comparing with the perfectly competitive market, you see that monopoly has higher price, says that, than the perfectly competitive market, and lower quantity, right? So let's calculate the consumers and producers surpluses here. We see that equilibrium in a monopoly is at point M. The quantity is QM at monopoly and the price is PM. So the consumer surplus here is PMAM. PMAM. So this is much smaller than the PCAC, which was consumer surplus when basically in the perfectly competitive market. So what happened to this rectangular that the consumer loss in monopoly? Actually, the producers get that. So the producer surplus is PMMFG. So the producers is taking this rectangular area of PMMKPC from the consumers by setting the price higher than the perfectly competitive market and setting the quantity lower than the perfectly competitive market. So the net gain in monopoly from the trade is AMFG. So yes, there is a rectangular area of PMMKPG, which is a surplus transferred from consumers to producers in monopoly. But then there is actually total deadweight loss of MCF that nobody gets that. So we call that this total deadweight loss MCF is basically welfare loss that nobody's getting that. So the total net gain in monopoly is smaller. Basically, the whole society is losing. Basically, they are losing because of misallocation of resources. So monopoly underproduces output and misallocates society's resources with deadweight loss of MCF. Now let's compare monopoly versus perfect competition. Monopolies charges higher prices and produces less compared to the perfectly competitive market, which charges lower prices and produces more. Monopolies has a smaller consumer surplus imperfect than the perfectly competitive market, that the consumers have larger consumer surplus. Monopoly, the producers, yes, they have bigger producer surplus than the perfectly competitive market, but in total, there is a smaller total surplus in monopoly than the perfectly competitive market, because there is a deadweight loss in monopolies. There is no deadweight loss in perfectly competitive firm, because in monopoly there is a misallocation of resources, and there is no misallocation of resources in perfectly competitive market, and we use all the resources perfectly efficiently, and there is no deadweight loss in perfectly competitive firm. So let's see why monopoly can actually monopolize the market, because there are barriers to entry. So the barriers to entry make it costly, either costly for new firms to enter to the market, or the probable basically reason could be because there is exclusive control over necessity input. So they have only these monopolies, they have the necessary inputs for production of that specific product or services. Nobody else has it. So that's and then, or because of the sunk cost, the initial cost is very expensive to enter to that market to produce. Or maybe the absolute cost, there is the absolute cost advantages for these monopolies over, so the other firms, they cannot compete with these monopolies. Or maybe because of there is a scale economies basically, which basically the big firms with mass production, they can actually decrease the average total cost. And there are maybe legal restrictions. So there is a need for licenses. For example, air transportation, they need licenses, or long distance companies, telephone companies, they need licenses. So they are monopolizing the market. Or maybe in medical care, there is a drug patents that government is protecting the R&D, research and development. Or there is occupational licenses for physicians that not everybody can actually practice, and etc. So there are so that's one reason there is a barrier of the basically legal barriers, and maybe there is a scale economies as an entry barriers. So this is basically the cost of medical care, and this is quantity of medical care. And in some basically production, there is the average total cost is decreasing as the number of the total production increasing, and we call that there is a scale economies so the bigger companies by mass production, they can actually produce at this level, so they can cut the cost. So the big hospital is producing at this level. By higher production level, they have lower costs compared to the new small hospital. By lower level of production, they have a high cost. So that's actually we call scale economies. So that actually, because this cost of production is very smaller for the big companies or big hospitals. The small hospital, they cannot compete with these big firms, so they can actually monopolize the market. Now, so let's see the buyer side of the market. Also, we have to briefly talk about that. In the real world scenario, the buyers also can possess varied degrees of market power. For example, and they can have a bargaining power. So that actually is called monopsony, which is a market with a single buyer. It's called monopsony. We talk about that in chapter 11. So this, in the United States, especially, for example, the Medicare and Medicaid, they have very high bargaining power, and they can actually, basically have a better price compared to the other buyers. So let's see, market number 3. Let's move from the perfectly competitive market and monopolistic competition to the monopoly, to extreme a spectrum of the market. Let's move to the middle intermediate market, monopolistic competition and product differentiation. Monopolistic competitions are very close to the perfectly competitive market. There are many sellers with relatively small market shares, and they have because they have very actually similar products, their demand care for each producer is very highly elastic, right? So because they have a lot of substitute for their product, although their product is a little bit differentiated. So means that they have a little elastic, for basically less elastic demand for their care, because they have some loyal customer for their product, brand name T-shirts, or say that branded type of medicine, such as Bayer's aspirin over generic aspirin. So these are like a little bit, they have their own loyal customer. So although there is no barriers to entry to prevent the excess profit, so in the long run, the new firms, if they see there is a profit, they enter to the market, and they enter until the profit is zero. So they have a slightly asymmetric information among buyers. So that's could be because of the advertisement, or because of the real basically quality of their product. So some they have a little bit market power over their output and prices. They can set their level of output and prices because they have some basically customers. They are loyal for their product, and they prefer their product even if it's a little bit more expensive than the similar product. So this differentiation of their product could be because of the advertisement, that manipulating the customers that their products are different than the similar product in the market. So they try, or maybe in reality they have a better quality than the other similar products. But there are so many similar products in the market that can be substituted. Or maybe they have a location preferences. So some, basically fine restaurants in a small city, they can actually set their own prices, although there are other restaurants as well in the neighborhood. So the good example would be Bayer's aspirin, for example, compared to the generic aspirin. Now, in the short run, the monopolistic competition, basically a firm may earn economic profit. So they may actually set their price higher than average total cost at the level of output, where the marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. So the other firms, they see there is a profit, they actually enter to the market because there is no barriers. So they enter to the market and produce that similar product, generic aspirin, and in the long run, so the market share for each firm diminishes. So therefore, demand faces basically by each firm falls, and then the economic profits becomes zero. And so we end up with a more elastic demand than in the short run. So in the long run, always remember the demands are more elastic because in the long run, there are more substitute for the product than in the short run. So the long run equilibrium for monopolistically competitive firm is, basically is looking like the monopoly. They have the marginal revenue. Remember, they can set their own prices and quantity. So the intersection of the marginal revenue and supply or marginal cost basically determines the quantity, and then they go up and hit the demand curve and they determine the price. So in the long run, basically the price is very equal to the average total cost. So it means that basically there is a zero profit, economic profit in the long run for the monopolistic competitive firm. So looking at basically the reason for differentiation, you see that there are pro-competitive and anti-competitive aspects of product differentiation. So if the product is different in a monopolistic competitive market, maybe because there is a imperfect information and product quality basically. So by advertising here, advertising is informative by leading to lower prices and higher quality. So the brand for the brand names and trademark basically, this is a good thing because advertisement here is pro-competitive. Because we are always encouraging competition, because remember the market gain for both producers and consumers, and the total market gain is the net gain is biggest in the perfectly competitive market. So we are encouraging competition. So the advertisement, as long as it is informative, so it is pro-competitive. And if advertisement is persuasive to manipulate the customer to basically shift their demand to the right and shift their preferences to the right, in that case, this is anti-competitive because the advertisement is basically trying to say that the monopolistic competitive products are different. And so they basically manipulate the customers and shift their demand and preferences to the right. So they create actually barrier to the entry because they try to say that their products and services are different than the other substitute product in the market. The fourth types of market is oligopoly. So the best example of the oligopolies is the auto industry with the leading auto manufacturers in the United States. For example, Ford, GMC, and General Motors and Chrysler. Sorry. The example of oligopolies in the United States is basically in the United States. The best example would be the health insurance industry, because a few health insurance industry are leading basically the market. So what is the market structure of oligopoly? The oligopoly market structures, there are few dominant firms So we have like 4, 5, 6 of them. So there are substantial barriers to entry, and the market power, individually or collectively, they have market power, these oligopolies. So their mutual interdependence, basically the dominant firms must be sufficiently basically size and limited. So they are very big. Basically, the behavior of any one firm influences the pricing and output decision of the other firm. So since they have a big market share, so any decision they make in cutting the level of production and changing the price impact the market for the other one as well. There are two types of oligopolies, collusive and basically competitive oligopolies. For the collusive oligopoly, all the firms in the industry cooperate rather than compete on price and output. So they jointly they wanted to maximize profit. Basically, they wanted to act as a monopoly. So they jointly cooperate to act as a monopoly to set their own, basically, the total market price and output. So therefore, in that case, if they cooperate, there will be cooperate to act as a monopoly. There will be a deadweight loss in the society and because of the misallocation of the resources. Now, so when basically there are two types, there are two ways how they cooperate. One of them, the first one is overt collusion, means that the representatives of the firms formally meet and to coordinate the prices and divide up the market share. So they decide, I'm taking the 20% of the market share, and you take 20%, the other one 20%, and then based on that level of production, they set the price, right? The second type is a tacit collusion, means that there is no formal meeting. Firms informally coordinate their prices. So there is a leader, basically firms. The leader set their prices, and the other firms, they are following basically the leader. So the price leadership model, we call that, means that the biggest firm actually set the level of production and price, and the other firm are following the leader. Now, in the collusive oligopoly, the difficulties associated with this type of collusion is that, first of all, there is a Sherman Antitrust Act that is always preventing the to the firms to monopolize the market, basically. So there is the other problem is with the informal tacit collusion. It is very difficult to interpret the motive behind the price adjustment made by the leader, basically industry. So the other basically firm, they have to decide whether this change in the price was a reaction to the decrease in the demand, or because the leader firm changed the basically price to improve the market share. So it's very difficult. And also there is a cost differences between the firms. So remember that the largest firms, usually they have a lower average total cost. So it's difficult to follow the leader, basically, firm. And so therefore, basically, that makes sometimes low entry barriers for some firms, and they can enter to the market. And when more firms come to the market, then basically, so there is an incentive to cheat on the agreement in the oligopoly. And remember, the success of the cartel, which basically in the oligopoly depends on the all the firm adhering to the common price. And if they don't follow the basically, they don't agree the common price, and they lower their price because they have a big market share, so the other one, they will lose the market, basically, to the firm actually lower the prices. So the second type of oligopoly is the competitive oligopoly. The firms in a competitive oligopoly, rivals may not coordinate their behavior, so they aggressively seek to individually maximize their own profit, right? So each firm has an incentive to lower their basically prices to marginal to up to the marginal cost. And so in that case, basically they act like a perfectly competitive market. So when the price equals the market marginal cost, then the resources are efficiently allocated, right? There's no problem with the competitive oligopoly. So so looking at the collusive or competitive oligopoly, so what determines they collude or basically be competitive? There are factors such as conjectural variation or matching behavior, the reaction of the rival to a firm's output decision, or determine market output and price, or depends on the firm's characteristics and the market condition. The matching behavior is, for fewer firms when they have higher barriers to entry, and then the social and historical ties basically determines this decision. And whether the maybe other factor would be the closer proximity and bonded rationality basically determines whether they collude or compete basically. And we give you let's have some examples here. For example, oligopolistic behavior in medical care market. One example would be a $2 billion blood banking industry in the 1990s. So there were two big, actually, firm here. American Red Cross had a 46% of market share, and American Blood Centers had a 47% market share, and 7% was basically for the individual small hospital blood bank. Now, we have had this federal policy since 1970s that had sanctioned local blood monopolies. But in 1998, this American Red Cross market share increased to 65% by entering various regional markets. Now, when we are looking at the impact of this, increase in market share, we see that this actually worked as a competitive oligopoly model, because when we look at the prices, we see that there were lower price prevail in the region where both of these American Red Cross and American Blood Centers coexisted in the area than in the regions where only one firm operated. For example, it was in Florida, the prices were lower than in New York because in New York, both of them actually were operating. Another example of the oligopolistic behavior in medical care market is the Johnson & Johnson stent market. In 1997, stent market basically, the Johnson & Johnson had 95% of the stent market share basically in 1997, and this market share fell to 8% in 1 year. So what happened? Johnson & Johnson angered key customers by denying the discount. They didn't actually give the discount. They kept their price so rigid. So the cardiologists put pressure on FDA to approve the new stent faster. And this, FDA approved this guidance corporation in and less than basically 45 days. 45 days, Guidance Corporation got the 70% of the market share of the stent market, and so that made this Johnson and Johnson's market share fell from 95% to 8%. So you can see that oligopoly market can actually lose the market share in less than basically 45 days. Depends on so many other factors, including the customers, the big customers, and also the FDA, the legal action.